Welcome everybody to our Warwick Ukraine-Belarus Hub webinar. I'm Paul Hansbury, and the title of today's webinar is Belarusian and Ukrainian Migrants, Challenges for the Future. For Ukraine, millions of people have left the country since the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. But in fact, there were already internally displaced people from the Donbass region predating that. And the scale of population movement of Ukrainians is staggering. To cite some numbers from a UK House of Commons report from this year, it says that there are 6.8 million Ukrainian refugees globally and 3.7 million internally displaced Ukrainians. That amounts to roughly a quarter of the pre-2022 population that has been forced to move owing to war and Russia's invasion. In the case of Belarus, at least 500,000 people are estimated to have left the country for European destinations since the 2020 crisis. Some estimates are far higher, but at any rate, that represents about 5% of the previous population. There has also been emigration to Russia, which is less spoken of and not counted in that statistic. Although the contexts for these large movements of people are very different, war in Ukraine, political repressions, primarily in Belarus, these movements of people create huge pressures economically, socially, and politically, both now and for the future. In this webinar, we will think about the challenges immigration has brought to the states themselves, how likely the migrants are to return, and the challenges facing immigrants in their host countries. We have a strong panel of speakers to address this topic, and they will each have 10 minutes to make some initial remarks, and then we will go to questions and answers, to a question and answer session. I shall introduce each of our speakers properly before they make their initial remarks, but briefly they are, in the order in which they will speak, Oleksandra Betliy, Ravenna Sohst, Tatiana Termacic, and Tatsiana Chulitskaya. We have interpretation into Belarusian available on this webinar, which can be accessed via the globe icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So please, if you need to hear in English or Belarusian, use the interpretation channels. I think I'm right in saying that all four of our speakers will be delivering their initial remarks in English today. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded both to our website and to our YouTube channel, hopefully tomorrow. So to the audience, please submit your questions via the Q&A box at any point during the webinar. They will be asked on your behalf after the speakers have delivered their initial remarks. If you would like to be identified, please write your name and affiliation in the box at the end of your question. Otherwise, the questions will be asked anonymously. Though the speakers will be able to see who you are. So our first speaker today, Oleksandra Betliy, is a leading research fellow at the Institute of Economic Research and Policy Consulting in Ukraine. She is an expert in the field of public finance, social policy, labour market policy, and she is also one of the main authors of the Institute for Economic Research's macroeconomic forecast. She has participated in international research projects for the World Bank, the UN Development Programme, and many more. And she served as an advisor to Ukraine's Minister of Finance from November 2018 to March 2020. So, Oleksandra, I mentioned the huge numbers of Ukrainians who have become refugees. What pressures has this put on Ukraine's economy, and what can be done to remedy the situation? The floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much. The topic is really important for Ukraine, which faces demographic crisis at the moment. I would say like that it is demographic crisis. Actually, labor migration in Ukraine was kind of high, as we thought it was high. I mean, like it was close to 2 million people before the war. And when I'm saying before the war, it's before 2014, when Russia actually started the war against Ukraine, annexed Crimea, and occupied part of Donetsk and Luhansk region. But it was kind of labor migration, which was more seasonal. Our people would go to European countries, predominantly, for example, Poland, and then they will return to Ukraine and spend money there. What has changed in 2014? We have received enormous number of internally displaced people. People were flying to Ukraine from occupied Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts and from Crimea, and we had more than 1 million of such people. But starting full-scale invasion, we received another problem that the war was so active, and this was kind of a full-scale invasion by Russia. And as a result, many people were trying to escape from the war, from the front lines, etc. And as a result, about you just mentioned 6 million people. Actually, the numbers vary about like people who are abroad now from Ukraine. There are numbers about 5 million as well, because sometimes this is double counting. Sometimes people are leaving and then they return into Ukraine, and this is kind of remarkable that people do return to Ukraine even now when the war is still going on, and we receive missile and drone attacks to all cities of Ukraine regardless where we live, actually. So I would use the government figure of 5 million of people who are abroad now, but also we have 5 million people of internally displaced people. So it's kind of a huge amount of migration, internal and external, which actually creates pressure on labor market. And according to the survey, business tendency survey that the Institute makes each month, we see that the biggest obstacle for business activity at the moment is lack of people. Sometimes it's lack of people just because we don't have good qualification of people, and there is a mismatch of skills mismatch or occupational mismatch between people who stay in Ukraine and people who is needed by our companies. And therefore, actually, one of the policies which is currently needed, and the government has started it last year, is education for adults. The different training and retraining programs. It's training for women, because women currently start working on the occupations where they didn't work previously. So it's not kind of those occupations that were traditional for Ukrainian women. These are drivers of heavy trucks. These are installation of solar panels and some others. So I mean, like this is kind of a really big need for qualification, requalification for women, but also there is a kind of regional mismatch. What we see currently is that when we talk about IDPs, sometimes IDPs do not want to move to kind of safer Western regions, but they remain at the regions where they close to their homes. So, for example, we have a big IDP community in Kharkiv city, in Dnipro city, even though I mean, like these are cities which are under constant selling, because people do not really want to go far from the homes, and they are hoping to return home. When we talk about IDPs again, then the surveys show that many of them do not have jobs. One of the reasons is also that women with children sometimes cannot work just because of online education. According to different estimates, in 2024, the 24% of Ukrainian children studied online. Again, this was the result of selling. This is a result of absent self-tests in some schools and kindergartens, and therefore this is kind of an obstacle for women to work if they have really small children. And that's why the government started another policy with the help of donors financing. There is a kind of a program to build self-tests in schools, in health facilities, in other educational facilities, in kindergartens, because if school or kindergarten doesn't have a good shelter, it cannot work offline. This is kind of, again, the policy that the government has to allocate money for in order to ensure that people are working. Another problem in Ukraine is also that we have a big number, and actually we will have more, of people with disabilities. Unfortunately, because of the war, these are not only veterans, but also civilians. And as a result, when we talk about labor market again, because this is kind of an issue now when we talk about impact on economy, the problem is that in order to have inclusive working place, you have to have investments. And this is something which is really difficult to do because, especially for our business sometimes, because business is already kind of resilient, it has to renovate after selling, it has to invest into development. And this is another investment that the business has to do. There is a small government program to help with this, but it's not sufficient. But it's something, again, that Ukraine will have to do. And we will actually, when we talk about like European Union countries, we will need also, like some focus there, how to actually make inclusive labor market more, because this wasn't focused for Ukraine, like for many years. When we talk about, again, people who are abroad, what we should do for these people to return, because we really need them, especially when we talk about children, is security. Security is the biggest topic now for economy. We actually start all economic discussions now and actually demographic discussions with the security issue. If security will be in Ukraine, people will try to return. According to different surveys, about more than 40% of Ukrainians who are now currently abroad, they would like to return to Ukraine. But the security matters. For security, we need air defense systems. We don't have enough, unfortunately, still, even though we have full-scale invasion like for more than 3 years, but we need more support in this. And the air defense means a lot for residential housing. It means a lot for business, for seaport infrastructure, etc. So like this is really needed. Just on Saturday night, we had really difficult selling, and not far from me, one street was almost burned. Like more than 10 houses were burned. It was private houses. So like when selling is going on, like it's kind of residential buildings which suffer and people are killed. And therefore, when we talk about this kind of that we would like Ukrainians to return, we have to understand that there should be consensus about the security issues, that people will return if there is security. Even though, again, some people are still returning already because this is home and they would like to be here. One of the policies that I would like to see from host countries is the training and retraining of Ukrainians who are now in European countries for the occupations and skills which will be needed in Ukraine for recovery and reconstruction. In Ukraine, we don't have enough architects, we don't have enough construction workers, we don't have enough some other occupations whom we will really need in order to recover the country and reconstruct those, like those buildings which were destroyed by Russians. And this is something that some countries have already started, I know, but this is something to elaborate more, because what we hear often is that host countries usually put Ukrainians with high-skilled labor before to not qualified labor places, etc., because of different issues. But this is something that would help to Ukraine. And again, just to mention, when we talk about Ukrainians abroad, some countries really want from this. And there were last year or even before, there was a study of Polish National Bank, which actually showed that Ukrainians brought to Poland more of value added in money than actually Poland spent for these people. And this is not only true for Poland, but also for other countries. And Ukrainians start opening businesses in other countries, opening the schools, etc. And this, therefore, I wouldn't say that our people abroad is a burden, but actually, in many cases, they bring value added and they bring development to those countries. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Oleksandra. There's plenty to think about there for Q&A. But next we will turn to Ravenna Sohst, who is a policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute Europe. She has conducted extensive research into questions around return migration, including a recent study on assessing return intentions of people displaced from Ukraine, which you can download from their website, migrationpolicy.org. Prior to joining MPI Europe, Dr. Sohst worked for the International Organization for Migration's Global Migration Data Analysis Center on migration forecasts and scenarios. I think I might have misread that slightly on my screen, but apologies. She has also worked for the OECD on studies relating to immigration, integration, and social mobility. I know you, Ravenna, you have undertaken cross-country analysis into migrants' intentions. So what are the key factors that determine emigrants' decision-making about returning? You have 10 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Paul, for the kind introduction. And hello, everyone. And special thanks also to Oleksandra, who started off, I think, this webinar really with very interesting insights. I want to use my 10 minutes introduction remarks to share some of the key findings from this recent study that you mentioned just now, and then also provide a quick discussions of the findings, because there has been some time, of course, that has been passed since the publication of the study. And so I want to contextualize a little bit those findings. And let me share my screen for that. Here we go. You should be able to see that. Great. So to get started, yes, as I mentioned, we conducted at the Migration Policy Institute a study on return intentions among refugees displaced from Ukraine. And we started with a very simple observation that even as of August 2024, IOM estimated that about 1 million had already returned to Ukraine. So we knew that despite the ongoing attacks and despite the fighting, as Oleksandra said also, some refugees are starting to return from abroad to Ukraine. And so that raised questions on our side relating to the drivers and the motivations behind these returns and behind return intentions. We wanted to look at variations across different host countries, and also the relationship between return intentions and host country support for refugees in these countries. And just briefly, not to bore you, but the data that we're analyzing has been collected by IOM. We're analyzing over 60,000 surveys with refugees in their host countries, so not in Ukraine, but in their host countries. And they've been collected between April 2022 and December 2023. We are covering 10 countries in this analysis, 10 countries from Central and Eastern Europe, as you can see here in the list on the bottom. We do not include some of the larger or largest hosting countries like Germany, for instance. You will see they're absent simply because the data doesn't cover, for instance, Germany in this survey. And we're focusing mainly on refugees holding Ukrainian nationality, even though in the report we have a small section that also focuses on third country nationals that were displaced from Ukraine. Here as a start, you see a map with return intentions, and I'm sure you have seen some version of this map probably before. Just two, I think, brief takeaways is that these maps on the left-hand side shows longer-term return intentions among Ukrainian refugees, which means those are return intentions in the indefinite future at some point when conditions allow to return. And as you will see, return intentions are overall very high, ranging from between 79, 80% perhaps in Hungary to 98% in the Republic Moldova, and variation. There's some variation between host countries, but overall the level is really, really high. And then on the right-hand side, you see also return intentions of Ukrainian refugees, but these are return intentions for the short term. So that means in the question and the way it was asked, it means that it happens within the foreseeable future. Some preparations already been ongoing or have been made to return. So it's a much more concrete measure of wanting to return and return desires. And what you see here is that there's a lot more variation across host countries. You will see that in Poland and Czechia, for instance, return intentions are really high, around 45% or so, and they're quite low in the Republic of Moldova and around 1.1%. So the goal for the study was to dive a little bit deeper into these variations and understand both at the personal level what drives persons to decide to return, but also at a more structural level, what are the policy and sort of the structural circumstances in host countries that can favor return intentions. And I brought three key findings, and we can of course discuss more about them, but just to get the quick insight into these. The first one is the role of labor market integration. And I think that matches also what other studies have found, which is that employment in the host country is a significant driver to return intentions, right? So those who are being employed in the host country are much less likely to say that they will plan to return in the short term. We also mapped this year in the figure against the time of displacement, which is another strong predictor of return intentions, usually decreases over time. And you can see that both for those who are employed in the host country and those who are not employed in the host countries, the intention to return decreases over time. But for those who are employed in the host country, they start off at a much lower rate, at around 10% or so. A second key finding relates to conditions within Ukraine, and notably the improved, the security and safety conditions. For those who return, the most important factor is really an improved security situation in the origin community or region in Ukraine. And inversely, for those that come from regions that have a high intensity of fighting and ongoing battles, the likelihood that they say they want to return is much lower. And then finally, a look at the structural conditions in host countries, which was perhaps the most important or interesting finding for us, because it showed that refugees in countries that have overall more wealthy, proper conditions, economically speaking, were more likely to return intentions to return to Ukraine in the short term. And similarly, support measures, both within the temporary protection status, but also outside of that, show that more inclusive support overall was more likely to have plans to return to Ukraine in the near future, but less likely to intend to return in the long term. And the way this fits is in a framework of capacity, I think, and the way that return intentions are also always a reflection of the way that persons can plan for a return. They can come perhaps for a shorter stay, they can visit, but all of this requires capacity and networks and a better integration to some extent, which can be strengthened by, of course, much more robust support and economic conditions in host countries. So as I said in the beginning, the data on which the study is based goes from 2022 to 2023. And since then, of course, a lot has happened and there's been quite some evolution. So I wanted to take a quick moment to sort of contextualize that in the time that has passed since then. And so two things to note on how the situation has evolved. One, of course, is that security concerns are still very much relevant, and there's ongoing uncertainty about the continuation of the war. The situation remains unstable with continued attacks and destruction, some of which have triggered new displacement, both outside of Ukraine, but also within Ukraine itself. And despite the start of peace talks, there's no improvement in the security situation so far, the lack of trust also in the progress of diplomatic efforts. On the other side, on the side of the host countries, mostly within Europe, we see also an evolution, both in the discourse and in the type of policies that have been designed. Some European member states are already reducing support for refugees, especially for new arrivals, but also ongoing support measures, such as financial support that's provided to Ukrainian refugees, measures that are supposed to support with temporary accommodation, for instance, and so on. And of course, there's in Brussels and in the capitals around Europe, there's a discussion around the eventual phasing out of the temporary protection status, which originally was supposed to expire in March this year, but now has been extended for another year, but the discussion is very much still ongoing. And we see that some European member states have started to offer alternative permits, especially for those, for instance, who are studying to go into student permits, or those who have an employment status to go into an employment permit, for instance. So we see that there's a push towards moving away from temporary protection at this point. And what does this mean for the potential impacts on return decision making and the findings that I discussed early on? I think one thing that's very clear and that was already seen in my in the first graph actually is that over time, of course, fewer refugees are planning to return to Ukraine. That's a trend that we already saw in the data. And when you update that with more recent data analysis and findings, for example, from IOM or UNHCR, who both conduct very extensive analysis on this, you can see that the intentions to return on the short term and the longer term are both continuing to decrease. And the intentions are especially dropping for refugees from regions experiencing attacks or fighting, for instance, in the east or in Kiev. The other thing is that decisions to return seem to be increasingly influenced by difficulties integrating and accessing right in host countries. This is something that we did not see yet in our analysis, but comes out from more recent data analysis. The reason being that there has been now some time for those persons to settle in, perhaps to try to get employment, find housing, and so on. But if there has been a prolonged period of difficulty, for example, in accessing employment, healthcare, or staying in precarious housing, along with a very high cost of living in several areas in these host countries, this can be a challenge that now pushes more persons to wanting to return. And then finally, upon return, there have been surveys with those who have returned to Ukraine, and there's a large share of returnees that report finding it difficult to access economic opportunities, employment. They find it more difficult than they had expected. And in addition, only 1/3 reports feeling safe in their current location upon return. And there's, of course, a possibility that there's some sort of feedback loop with the diaspora, those who are still outside of Ukraine and those who have returned, communicating, and there could be a loop where this also influences return attention based on the experiences of those who have returned more recently. So I think this is all to get us started. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ravenna. Just a reminder to the audience that you're welcome to start putting questions for our speakers into the Q&A box already. Our next speaker will be Tatiana Termacic, who heads the Secretariat of the Committee on Migration, Refugees and Displaced Persons of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. One of her past responsibilities during a 25-year career at the Council of Europe was promoting the abolition of the death penalty in Belarus. Since the fraudulent election of 2020 in Belarus, she has supported the Belarusian democratic forces by encouraging and suggesting ways for closer formal ties with the Council of Europe. She initiated a report addressing the specific challenges faced by Belarusian migrants in exile, adopted by the Assembly in June 2023, and the subsequent Luxembourg Solutions, a practical guide for national policymakers on addressing the issue in Council of Europe member states. Tatiana, in your view, what are the prospects for emigrants' return and the conditions needed to facilitate this? How can the Council of Europe contribute to this process? You need to unmute yourself, please.
Thanks a lot, Paul. I hope I'll be able to address this question. So, first of all, I'd like to start with something which is important for me to recall, is that the fact that Europe has shown greater solidarity towards Ukrainians and Belarusians than towards migrants from other countries equally escaping war and political repression does not mean that they do not face significant challenges in exile. And the way these challenges have been addressed and the level of integration in the host countries will likely constitute criteria for return to their country for them once the conditions are met. While most of the people who left hoped for a more or less rapid return home, it's clear that nearly 5 years after the fraudulent elections in Belarus and more than 3 years of full-scale war in Ukraine makes the possibility of such return more uncertain. Furthermore, the best-case scenario for both countries is unlikely to happen soon. However, I think we can get a common understanding of the preconditions of a possible return and of the measures to be in place to ensure a less traumatic return than the departure. And actually, we've already heard some very valuable suggestions from Oleksandra and Ravenna. But looking at the past experience, the prospects, I have to say, are not so encouraging. If we look at Chile, and at the coup, the Pinochet coup in 1973, in that period, about 1 million Chileans left. And after democratization, some 160,000 returned to Chile. The war in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 90s provoked the displacement of more than 2.5 million persons, both internally and abroad, and 1 million eventually returned, so less than half. And in Croatia, also during the war in the 90s, out of the 350,000 Serbs who fled, less than a third returned. So what we learn about these experiences is that the prospect of return depends on political, economic, and security conditions, and that exile often leads to lasting demographic changes. And indeed, as life goes on, a temporary displacement may transform into a permanent one. I don't know if Tanya will mention a Baroque survey conducted by the Baroque Center on the adaptation strategies of Belarusian and Ukrainian migrants in the EU labor market. And it showed that only 35% of Belarusians who are living in Lithuania and Poland plan to return. And only 22 of Belarusians with lower levels of education. For them, for the Belarusians in exile, the main precondition for return is the end of political repression and regime change. In the same survey, as Oleksandra mentioned earlier, and Ravenna, Ukrainians cite the cessation of hostilities and also economic improvement as a primary condition for return. And here again, it is unclear when peace and social justice will prevail in Ukraine. And it's really a tight balance between integration and return. Many Ukrainians abroad express a desire to contribute to Ukraine's reconstruction. Actually, not many, but most of them, even if they don't return. For them, it is important to have a genuine choice and not to be forced into irregular status or involuntary return. Their decision to stay or return will likely depend on their living conditions and opportunities for their children, especially the degree of their integration in the host country. The challenges met by the Belarusians and Ukrainians abroad are well documented. And notably, the Parliamentary of the Council of Europe has adopted 3 reports on the topic, and I will put the links in the chat, and also adopted the practical guide, the Luxembourg Solutions for National Parliamentarians and other policymakers on finding legal and practical solutions to the challenges faced by Belarusians in exile who fled the Lukashenko regime. Furthermore, the Assembly will also prepare a report on facilitating economic recovery and resilience of Ukraine, from voluntary returns to enhanced cooperation and investment. And this report should be adopted in 2026. And we anticipate that, like for the others, the idea will have to have a people-centered approach in the policy making which will be proposed. We've heard already that the Ukrainians fleeing the Russian full-scale attack in February 2022 were the first ones to benefit from the European Union's Temporary Protection Directive. And this has enabled millions to rapidly access protection and rights in host countries. And we all remember and indeed took part in the incredible solidarity movement which developed across European countries. As it stands today, the temporary protection has been extended until March 2026, and UNHCR has recently issued recommendations to continue these arrangements for at least 12 more months, given the security situation. I think this is an important document, and I'll also give you a link to it. When we look at the main challenges faced by Ukrainians abroad, Not surprisingly, of course, it was the necessity to learn the language of the host country, access to employment, and access to housing. And these three factors are tightly related. These are three tightly related factors of integration. For children, school, of course, is a great way to integrate. And sometimes there have been difficulties in integration when older children had also to follow the Ukrainian curriculum online. And after 3 years, we hear people speaking more about depression, about the feeling that they don't feel anywhere at home anymore. They speak about the broken links with their close ones who remained in Ukraine. And they suffer a lot from uncertainty, from not being able to understand what future lays ahead. In all this time, their lives have tremendously changed. For Belarusians, even more time has elapsed since the repression after the 2020 elections. And while the majority belong to a middle-high social class, this doesn't mean that their lives were not affected as well, and that they were able to maintain their previous quality of life. Many were obliged to take any job, mainly manual labor. Also, the security threats coming from Belarus, perceived by Poland and Lithuania, significantly hamper their smooth integration, to start with the legalization of their stay and freedom of movement. I'm sure that Tanya will mention it later. The Belarus Democratic Forces have been working hard to alleviate these challenges, and notably through the people's embassies. The next steps of the Luxembourg solutions I mentioned will be the development of IT implementation tool with the aim to encourage host countries to remove these obstacles and to help the people's embassies in fulfilling their tasks. So discussions are currently ongoing between the democratic forces and the Council of Europe, so that it's included on the list of activities to be financed. I'd like to flag three common features, it seems to me, to both communities and countries. The first is divided societies. Not everyone could or was willing to leave the countries seeking safety. This has led to distended relationships between those who left and those who stayed, with possible hard feelings because of the lack of understandings of what the others lived during these years. The second common feature is, we've heard about it, is the demographic crisis and brain drain. I will not come back to this, but this is an important aspect which has to be addressed. And the third one is, of course, the high potential resource for recovery. Both diasporas represent critical human capital for future reconstruction and democratization, provided conditions for return are met. The better they are supported in host countries, the more they will be able to make an enlightened choice whether to return or not. So I've grouped about 12 measures which could ultimately support the return of Belarusians and Ukrainians to their respective country when the conditions are met, and should they wish so. First is to implement the UNHCR recommendations I mentioned earlier. Also to implement the Luxembourg solutions and support the development of the IT implementation tool. Support the Council of Europe's pivotal role through the development of new cooperation programs that support diaspora investment, integration, and eventual return. The three main prerequisites for well-grounded integration should be reinforced. This is to expand language learning opportunities beyond basic levels to support professional integration, to increase funding for housing and rental support, and to enhance access to the labor market through the recognition of qualification and job creation. Then it's very important to organize diaspora internships in national authorities of the host countries to foster future bilateral cooperation and invest in human capital for post-conflict reconstruction. It's also important to facilitate mobility between the host and home countries so that people maintain the contact with their close ones. And also, as we heard, to focus on vulnerable groups. Elderly people can contribute to preserve and promote cultural heritage. It's important to ensure mutual recognition of the disability status and to provide targeted support for single mothers, including language and employment assistance.
Tatiana,
yes?
could I ask you to come to the conclusion? I know you're making a list of practical recommendations. Okay. I will give you an opportunity to finish your list when we come to Q&A.
Okay, I will just sum up that the preservation of identity and culture is very important. Facilitate voluntary returns and to finalize, I think it's for people to wish to return. It's important that they are offered. Sorry, I start again. The return must be attractive. For people to want to return, the return must be attractive. And this should be done in the country itself, but also in the host countries, because by ensuring a smooth integration of Belarusians and Ukrainians in exile, host countries will contribute to creating a solid community able to support the building of a new democratic Belarus and the rebuilding of Ukraine. So I'll stop here and I'll add more points later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tatiana. Apologies for disrupting your flow. But I think you've given us some good practical recommendations, and combined with some of the survey data we heard from Ravenna and some of the insights into the economic effects from Oleksandra, we're getting quite a broad picture of the situation here as it pertains to migration. So it's all excellent what we're building. So we will move to our final speaker, Tatiana Chulitskaya, who is a political scientist of Belarusian origin, currently a senior researcher in the Institute for International Relations and Political Science at Vilnius University. Since 2011, she has worked with the Informal Educational Project and think tank SIMPA Bipart, and she is also a valuable part of the Warwick Ukraine-Belarus Hub team. Her research interests include civil society and civic participation in non-democratic regimes, authoritarianism, public policy and public administration, and European neighbourhood policy. Tatiana, you join us from Vilnius, I think. How are Belarusian emigrants advocating for their interests, and what challenges does the Belarusian diaspora in Lithuania face? You have 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and thank you to all previous speakers. It's a very good introduction, and I will try to follow, especially what Tatiana mentioned before me. First of all, we know that after 2020, there were three main destinations of Belarusian migration. These destinations were Poland, Lithuania, and Georgia. If Poland and Lithuania are more or less usual suspect for this migration because of geographical closeness, Georgia was chosen by Belarusian migrants because of they do not need visa to go to Georgia, and also because this country at that time was perceived like a kind of a place easy to go. But of course it has changed, but I will mention it later on. At the moment, after 5 years passed since 2020 and beginning of the political crisis, all diasporas, Belarusian diaspora in different countries, they are facing different challenges. I will mention at least 3 of them. The first one are transnational repressions, because at the moment we know that members of Belarusian diaspora, especially those who are civically and politically active, they are the target of Belarusian secret services, and they are persecuted despite not being physically in the country. The second issue are problems with the documents, because some time ago, Belarusian government deprived Belarusians abroad a right to get their documents, in particular their national passports, when they reside abroad. And of course, as you can imagine, it created a big difficulty for those who can't come back to the country to get the document in order. And they also can't solve any practical issues, for instance, with properties, which is still left in the country, and or some other like civic and other issues. The third set of problems are numerous social, economical, but also psychological challenges Belarusians Belarusian migrants are facing abroad while being abroad, and these challenges need to be addressed. The last but not the least is that after 2022 and beginning of the Russia's full-scale military invasion of Ukraine, public perception of Belarusian migrants and of Belarusians in democratic countries, in Lithuania in particular, this perception, public perceptions have changed. And these perceptions, if previously Belarusians were perceived quite well, they were perceived as victims of authoritarian regime, of like injustice in their country. After 2022, we observe that situations and perceptions are more ambivalent. And at the same time, Belarusian migrants, they often perceived through so-called lens of deservedness, basically hosting societies and also government of the countries. They try to see and to evaluate if and whether Belarusian migrants and diaspora, they deserve to be supported by their country and by their states. And taking into consideration all these things, I think that situation of Belarusian diaspora in Lithuania is to some extent quite typical, but on the other hand, it's on extreme, because Lithuania, we know, is on the border with Belarus. We know about all the security threat. So this country needs to deal simultaneously with 2 things. One is how to deal and how to support Belarusian migrants, especially those who are politically persecuted. But on the other hand, Lithuania and Lithuanian government needs to deal with serious security threat, which are coming like every day. And we know that Zapad military thrills will happen in September. And of course, it rose a lot of concerns among public, but also among the government of the country. If in 2020, as I mentioned, when Belarusians arrived to Lithuania, there were mostly positive attitudes towards them, and it was both on the level of the government and on the level of society. On the level of the government, indeed, Lithuania opened a humanitarian corridor in August 2020. It was a big deal because COVID limitations were still in place. Belarusians became the fastest growing foreign group in Lithuania before 2022. Indeed, the Belarusian migrants who arrived to Lithuania in 2020 was quite a diverse group. Some of the migrants are political and politically persecuted, some, including media, political, civic activists. However, there is also a group of labor migrants, of those who left the country because of deteriorating economical, but also political conditions, and especially after 2022, this group of economic migrants, it has increased. It became larger than it was, and at the same time, my point is that sometimes it's very difficult to separate economical motives and economical reasons and grounds from political reasons and grounds. So of course there are cases of purely political persecution, but on the other hand, when some businessmen and some, I don't know, IT companies are leaving Belarus, it's a big question whether it's purely economical or whether it is still political. I'll leave this question open, but it's essential, I think, to think about it. Arrival of politically persecuted Belarusians to Lithuania in general strengthens Lithuanians' intention to be a regional promoter of democracy, and Lithuanian government supported Belarusians a lot. Many civil society organizations and media re-established themselves in Lithuania, but what is also important that the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, which is pro-democratic institution, is established and is functioning in Lithuania up till now. But of course, there are some other Belarusian political structures in exile which function in Poland, for instance. After 2022, situation for Belarusian migrants in Lithuania, but also in other countries, has changed, unfortunately. On the one hand, pro-democratic Belarusians, they totally supported Ukraine. They expressed their greatest sympathy, but also, like, on practical terms, they provided a lot of support. However, on the other hand, there was Belarusian government who supports Kremlin, who supports Putin, and that's created a kind of this dubious relations towards Belarusians and especially towards Belarusians in Lithuania. For Lithuania, it meant that along with situation of threat from Belarusian regime, there were also signs, and there are signs up till now, that Belarusian but also Russian secret services, they are trying to use diaspora for their own purposes. They're trying to approach people there, to use them for some spying and other issues, and it's a huge threat. But on the other hand, this situation also created a kind of ambiguous situation for Belarusian migrants. At the moment in Lithuania, there are limitations on legislative level for Belarusian migrants and for Belarusian diaspora. They are facing with additional security checks. They are facing with some checks related to Ukraine. For instance, they should make declaration that they do not support Russia's war in Ukraine. And also they have some limitations for those who still can cross the border. And these limitations are officially established. And what we also observe in Lithuania, that on practical level, because these official restrictions have been established, it's quite complicated for migration services and for officials who are dealing with Belarusian migrants somehow to separate those who deserve to be supported, I mean those who are like purely politically persecuted, from other Belarusian diaspora. And this situation caused a lot of anxieties, a lot of difficult attitudes of Belarusian diaspora. And at the moment, what we are observing here in Lithuania, that the number of Belarusian migrants is decreasing, and like Belarusian diaspora in 2025, like in comparison with 2022 or 2024, sorry, has decreased. Summing up, indeed, at the moment, Belarusian diaspora, it faces with a challenge to be supported. It faces with a challenge to establish itself. It faces with the challenges of Belarusian authoritarian regime, and it needs to find their way to advocate their interest, but at the same time to solve a lot of economical, psychological, and social problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Yes, the psychological effects was something that I thought we might come back to when it comes to questions. So to the audience, now we've had four with a wide-ranging initial set of remarks from our four speakers. I encourage you to ask questions of them. Please put your questions into the Q&A box. So to get us started, though, we'll ask a quick question of each of the speakers. I'll ask all of the questions together, and then we will go around in the order in which you spoke. So for Oleksandra, although it was very marginal in your presentation to us, you quite reasonably corrected a figure that I cited and commented that there was some double counting. And it strikes me that here I'm in the UK and we don't have the complications of war, and yet official data and statistics are often shown to be unreliable for various reasons, particularly when it comes to some quite fundamental demographic information. So I just wondered if you could comment a little bit on how reliable the data that we have on emigration and internally displaced people is. So I'll come back to you in a minute with that. I'm going to ask the question of the others so that people have time to prepare. For Ravenna, so you commented that on one of your findings that where emigrants have employment in a host country, that reduces their likelihood of returning. Unless I missed it, which I may have done, I don't think you gave us, you told us about levels of employment among emigrants in the different countries. And so I was wondering, because you commented that in Poland you had this very high finding of people intending to return, whereas in Moldova you had the inverse. And it struck me that was at odds with where I would have expected ease of employment finding employment to have been. So I just wondered if you had some information concerning employment levels among immigrant communities. Tatiana, you made a very interesting comment about divided societies, which I was going to ask about, but I won't. So I will ask a very quick question, and I'm aware that you didn't quite get through your full list of recommendations. So my very quick question was just to pick up on the very first thing you said, which was that Europeans have shown greater solidarity towards Ukrainians and Belarusians than to many other migrant communities. And I appreciate for Belarusians and Ukrainians that might be something they're glad to hear, but it's also something that might be quite concerning. And so I just wondered how you can explain that how you would explain that difference. But also, please do finish your list of recommendations, practical recommendations about what can be done. And finally, to Tanya Chulitskaya, you commented on, I mean, as we understand, perceptions towards the Belarusian diaspora in Lithuania has changed, particularly following 2022 and the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. You then ended talking about how Belarusian security services, Russian security services are infiltrating the diaspora and trying to use it. And so I wondered how perceptions have changed within the diaspora itself. So those are my questions for everybody. If we go to Oleksandra first of all, please.
Yeah, indeed, the statistics during full-scale invasion, it's a kind of difficult topic. Actually, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there was some relaxation of compulsory reporting by some companies as well. And therefore, our Ukrainian statistical service doesn't actually have all data from all companies as well, but there are other methods how they calculate different statistics, but we do have problems with statistics. When we talk about demography, currently there is kind of an estimate more than a reliable figure that there are kind of about 31 million Ukrainians in Ukraine. When we talk about IDPs, figures are more or less reliable, especially when we talk about registered IDPs, because not all IDPs do register, and therefore sometimes it's also estimate, sometimes it's kind of survey result, etc. But it's kind of more or less reliable figure. When we talk about those people who are abroad, then there is kind of mirror statistics. I mean, like from Ukraine, how many people left, etc. And then our people in Ukraine, I mean, like our Ukrainians have to register, for example, in European Union, in United States, Canada, to live there. I mean, like not, 90 days of short-term visa, but longer periods, and therefore they have this temporary residential status. Therefore, it's kind of more or less reliable. Why we have this double counting is that sometimes people are moving, for example, they first move to Poland, they receive this temporary residential status, and then they move to Germany, and sometimes they do not actually liquidate the previous one. Also, the figures of immigrants, we have to take into account that there are, according to different estimates, more than 1 million Ukrainians are in Russia and Belarus, but sometimes these people go there, I mean, like they cannot leave occupied territory through Ukrainian territory, so they have to go to Russia, Belarus, and then they flee to Ukraine or European countries, and therefore we have also double counting. Recently, we have already several cases which were in use when actually children are returning to Ukraine, I mean, like through Russian territory and Belarus territory as well. So, I mean, like those who children that they receive in passports, and then they are actually coming back home to Ukraine. And this is kind of really tremendous. I mean, like this is kind of really like good cases which actually provide us hope that actually on occupied territories there are many Ukrainians who stay there, but they expect Ukraine to actually liberalize those territories. But statistics is an issue, and I'd like to reflect on some issues that were mentioned before by different speakers. I'm sorry for this. Is that indeed we have really big mental problems in Ukraine. I mean, like of Ukrainians that Ukrainians face because of actually missile attacks, drone attacks. According to different surveys and analysis, 36% of Ukrainians report increased stress, and 11 have high stress levels. And this is kind of a problem that we have to face, that we are in the full-scale invasion for such a long period already, that when we talk about mental health, it's not only needed for veterans, which is usually discussed, but also for all Ukrainians. When I talked that 24% of Ukrainian children study online, this is also a problem. We have huge educational gap. And the problem is that children haven't had experience studying offline. And as a result, these children do not have soft skills, which are really needed for future labor market. Because when we read about future labor market, there are different estimates and the different projections which occupations would be more important or less, but everybody agrees that soft skills like communication skills are really important, and our children are deprived of the right to have this communication, and that's why sometimes there are already kind of government and the civil society intentions supported by donors to create, for example, educational spaces. So we are not rebuilding schools like walls as we get used to, but these are underground educational spaces in Zaporizhia Oblast, in Kharkiv Oblast. We have underground schools, so which enable children to go there. But the question that Ukraine will face after the victory is how to actually reduce this educational gap, how to help children to acquire those knowledge which are needed for future labor market, as well as how to fight the stress impact.
Thank you. And Ravenna? The question about employment in the host countries.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So based on the data that we used for the study, it wasn't possible to calculate employment rates because the sample in the countries varied widely, and there was a non-representative sample for the populations in each of these countries. But of course, there are other sources that do look at employment rates across countries within the European Union and even outside of that. And we see really large variations in the level of employment in these different countries. So what we found, for instance, or what we saw in some of the data that IOM released was that overall the employment rates of Ukrainian refugees tended to be higher in Eastern and Central European countries. For example, they found in 2023, so relatively early on, that 76% of respondents were active in the labor market, were employed in Poland, 71% in Estonia, and 68% in Czechia, whereas the employment rate was only 27% in Germany in the first quarter of 2024, and I think somewhat lower still in Switzerland, but higher again, for instance, in the Netherlands and in the UK. So I don't think you can give like an overall view of employment rates and why that is to all of these countries. It depends very much on both the type of profiles that come into these countries, of course, and then also on the types of jobs that are available in the countries, in what type of sectors and at what types of skill levels, and then to see to what extent that matches to the refugee population. But I think one thing that's really important and that we already mentioned also earlier is really that this types of skills development is a very important driver for any types of future return reconstruction discussions, because the skills that are garnered at the moment in the host countries can be extremely valuable for return upon cessation of the hostilities, of course. So yeah.
Thank you. And Tanya, why is this? How do you explain the European solidarity for towards Ukrainians and Belarusians differing from other migrant groups? If you could just want to address that briefly, and then your practical recommendations that I cut you short on.
No problem. So I think you've seen the current discourse on migration in Europe, which is rather negative, and this is a general issue. And I don't know if you're aware that recently 9 heads of governments wrote to the European Court of Human Rights asking the court to change its interpretation of the European Convention on Human Rights in regard to migration. So we are living times when migration is portrayed as something very negative. But I think the reason why the solidarity was different for Belarusians and Ukrainians. For Belarusians, one thing is, I think, really Lithuania and Poland, they know their neighbor, and so they knew the difficulties the people who are fleeing knew. Of course, that did not prevent all the difficulties which Tanya explained just now, and it doesn't mean that Belarusians don't face challenges, but the fact that Poland and Lithuania knew what was the Lukashenko regime made it easier for them to accept people. And I think, by the way, Belarus is still considered as a safe country in some of other European countries. So the further you are from Belarus, the less you know about the regime, and the more difficult it is for people to get proper documentation or to get asylum or subsidiary protection. So I think that it's not the same in Europe, in the whole of Europe. For Ukraine, I think it's for the Council of Europe, it was such a shock that one of the member states attacked another member state. And here that was a natural solidarity again, because it was I think a total shock, and Ukraine is a European country, and I think this helped the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive, which hadn't been activated in 2015 when Syrians were fleeing the Assad regime. So that's, in short, why I would explain this solidarity. But I have to say that after all these years, we don't feel so much solidarity anymore. All the people who hosted Ukrainians at the beginning when they came, and this has drawn out a little bit. I mean, and I think it's important to continue to express, to show solidarity towards all people who need protection in Europe. And in particular, now we're speaking about Ukrainians and Belarusians. And for that, so I come back to the recommendations. I wasn't able to finalize. I think it's important. I was stopped at the importance to balance integration and keeping and promoting national and cultural identity. And for Belarusians, it's really since the elections that there has been a revival of the Belarusian cultural identity, and it's important to keep it and to promote it. And that's why it's important to have classes for children in Ukrainian, in Belarusian, but also to ensure that they follow the regular curriculum of the host country. And thinking of return, the children who will return to their country, it's very important that they keep their language skills and that they keep the links they established in the host country. And so it will be important to ensure language classes in Ukraine and Belarus of the host countries, so that children can continue to develop their linguistic skills, and also exchanges through schools, so that children can keep the relationship they had when they were in exile. And I seen the question in the chat, how to prevent forced returns, to cut it short. It's very difficult to answer this question, but just to say, really, it's important that there is a choice for people to decide whether they want to stay or return to their country, and they should not find themselves in an irregular situation. They should have the possibility to stay regularly in the host country if they wish so. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. I will give the rest of the panel an opportunity to answer the question in the chat about resorting to coercion or forced returns. And you make an important point about integration involving balancing your home identity and culture, but also adopting part of the new identity. Otherwise, that we kind of understand that discrimination and isolation of communities happens in these situations. Tanya, infiltration of the KGB, probably into Belarusian diaspora groups. Are perceptions within the diaspora itself?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. It's a very good question. First of all, I'd like to mention and to pay attention to the fact that it's not just Belarusian KGB who is acting against Belarusian diaspora, but they're acting together with their Russian counterparts. And it's essential to understand the quality and the amount of these attacks towards diaspora. It's not about Lithuania and Poland only, but of course we see recent cases in these two countries, and they are more than concerning. However, we should also keep in mind that practically what is going on, that Belarusian diaspora, Belarusian civil society, political activists, they need somehow to struggle with well-prepared secret agents and their actions, and it's not a kind of a game which can be won by on this amateur level. So basically, support of secret services of the countries and intelligence of Poland, Lithuania is needed here. It's provided here, but it should be done even more, and it's a very serious threat which should be addressed not just on the level of these countries, but also on the European level, I believe. We also knew, for instance, that Belarusian and Russian secret services, they, for instance, in Lithuania, they use malign narratives, this false narrative of Litvianism, for instance, when they were saying that Belarusians want or question the statehood of Lithuania. And it's still a big deal. However, there are official explanation of Lithuanian secret services that it was an attack of Russians and Belarusian intelligence. However, still you understand that for public, it's very difficult to make this distinction between what is disinformation, what is information. And when it comes to the diaspora itself, of course, all this situation with security services attacks, with these transnational repressions, with questionable and ambiguous attitudes of hosting communities towards them, of course, it raises a lot of anxiety once again, misunderstanding with hosting communities, a lot of concerns about the future, like what to do, where to go. Unfortunately, we do not have any good quantitative studies here, but we know from qualitative studies that people indeed are saying that they are desperate because they left the country where they were persecuted and they found themselves abroad in Lithuania, for instance, or even worse in Georgia, and they really do not know what to do further and what to do now. But the last a bit more positive thing from my side that it means that more advocacy of the diaspora itself is needed. Belarusians need to talk. Office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and other political structures in exile, and they talk a lot. But these advocacy efforts, they should be intensified, I think. So summing up, diaspora is to some extent, of course, also feels and is suffering from these attacks. There are a lot more mistrust among the members of diaspora, but at the same time, it also there is an understanding that something needs to be done.
Okay, thank you. I have two questions from the audience. Okay. Okay, so the question has been answered in the chat, but I will read the question aloud. And Ravenna, since you've just answered it, perhaps you would, once I've read the question, you will give your answer in the so that everyone can hear it. So the question is about voluntary returns to Ukraine, which Tatiana Termacic commented on. So the question is about voluntary returns to Ukraine, but also about Belarus in the future. There is a lot of research already showing that returns of groups such as Bosnians, Iraqis, Syrians, and others have been branded as voluntary, but they have been enforced in ways, formally and especially informally, that are more coercive. How could this be avoided in the future? Incentivizing returns is one way, which the speakers discussed, but will that be sufficient? And would governments of host countries or countries of origin seek to resort to other means? And how can this be prevented? We heard very well from the lucid presentation on the diaspora that a lot of transnational repression takes place regarding Belarus. How do you see this conundrum resolved, especially given the huge demographic crises for both countries? So, Ravenna, you have typed an answer. I haven't read it, so I don't know what you're going to say. But would you like to address that? Just sort of, well, briefly, please.
Yeah, of course. I just started to give it a go, and please, to the others, feel free to add on to this, because I think there are different angles and aspects to discuss in this question. So I think the question referred to the use of so-called voluntary return, which is often used in the European context to incentivize migrants that do not or do no longer hold a legal status to return to their host countries, and is often seen as an alternative to forced returns. So in that case, the question is, you have to return in either way. Either you can do so voluntarily with the support and assistance, for example, of IOM, or you will be forcibly returned. But in the case of Ukraine, this is very different, because in Ukraine, either these refugees hold a temporary protection status, or at the moment, other types of statuses. Some have refugee status or are here on employment permits and so on. And for them, there is at the moment no enforcement mechanism. And that's also what the latest recommendation of UNHCR on the extension of the temporary protection also says, that the legal status of Ukrainians should be maintained, exactly to protect them for that. So I think to say that shortly, the most important way to protect persons against the forced return is to maintain and make sure that they have a legal status in Europe, because that is the key for not allowing that. At the same time, there are already some member states in Europe that have voluntary return programs to Ukraine. But in these cases, they have to be truly voluntary and well informed about the conditions of the return and upon return. So this is a little bit of a different status. And then I also linked the position of UNHCR on voluntary return to Ukraine, just as a information and in case that's relevant.
Okay, thank you. And Oleksandra would like to come in.
Yeah, I agree that even after the victory, probably for some time, but really short one, probably, I mean, like the status would remain. I mean, like because especially there are Ukrainians that lost their housing, and I'm not sure that we will liberalize all territory of Ukraine, which is currently occupied by Russians. And this is a question of housing. And but I think that some of the countries will, but I don't think that it's kind of forced kind of thing. Is that some countries do reduce already the programs of support of Ukrainians, like free housing, etc. This will actually push some Ukrainians return home. And but I don't think that this is kind of really bad policy. Okay, I'm probably now more selfish when we talk about economic impact of Ukraine, because we need Ukrainians in Ukraine, but again, we need security first. And this is kind of, these things should be connected. The security should be ensured, or better security should be ensured, and Ukrainians will be returning home as well, which service actually shows. And then, again, that host countries should already provide some policies to equip Ukrainians with better knowledge and skills just to find their jobs in Ukraine. And this is somewhere where, again, European support will be helpful for Ukraine. It's kind of ensuring investments to Ukrainian, to creation of jobs in Ukraine. Therefore, Ukrainians who will return to Ukraine will actually find these jobs, and they will actually be more self-sustainable than they currently are in some of the European countries where they still don't have some knowledge or language skills, etc.
Okay, thank you. So we do have another question. So, but Tanya, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I will just comment briefly on it. I will echo Ravenna what she said about legal status. I think it's the main protection and the main way to protect Ukrainians and Belarusians and other refugees. Otherwise, they're just not protected. So for Belarusians, it's a bit more complicated, for instance, in context of Lithuania, because at the moment there are this additional checks of Belarusians as potential security threat to Lithuania. And on the one hand, it's once again understandable because there are security threats. However, we also know about cases when some Belarusians were recognized as a security threat because, for instance, of their previous compulsory service in Belarusian army, and they were they left European Union, then they were persecuted by secret services, and then they finished up in Belarus, and they finished up in Belarusian prison. And this is, of course, this is the case of one of the former Kalinovsky regiment volunteer. So basically, the person was struggling for Ukraine, then left it for Lithuania, and then he lost his legal status, and now he is de facto in Belarusian prison. So this is a kind of a personal story, but I think it illustrates quite well that when European countries implementing this approach towards refugees and towards Belarusian refugees in particular, these cases should be evaluated, on individual case, not as a trend, not as a just having red flag, and then to mark a person as a, for instance, security threat. And it's not typical for Lithuania only. Unfortunately, such cases happen. So in general, this question, like what to do with Belarusian migrants and how to return them home, unlike Ukraine, it's really question of a very far future, and it depends on how situation will be going on in the country. But as of the current moment, as of today, I would just echo that we need normal legal status for all Belarusian migrants, especially for those who left the country because of political reasons.
Thank you. So we have one last question. It's quite a long question, but I will read it out. It's a little bit of a multiple choice question, so I'm going to ask each of our speakers to give a response in no more than one sentence, please. So the question is this. Is there any data or anecdotal evidence to shed light on whether the intentions or desire to return are linked more strongly to host country policy or personal circumstance and feelings? And how much are those really mitigated by the domestic conditions? For example, if one perceives returning to Belarus or Ukraine as relatively safe at some indeterminate point in the future, would a favourable host country policy or success in landing a job there be detrimental to choose not to return? In short, from three variables, personal circumstances, host country policy, and domestic conditions, which one do you think is the most prominent in its effect? Who wants to take that first of all? Tatiana, Termacic.
Thank you. I fully agree with what my homonym just said, that it's very important to look at the individual circumstances of each person's, in the case of Belarusians. And I think that each person has his or her own story, and the personal circumstances will balance between the situation in the host country and the situation at home. I mean, that comes from many discussions I had with many Ukrainians and Belarusians, and each of them will interpret differently the fact that they're better or less integrated in the host country.
Okay, so your answer is it depends, which is a reasonable answer.
The person, it depends on the person. Yeah.
Ravenna?
Yes, I think it depends is for sure the right answer, but I think drawing on the broader literature, perhaps of displacement and return from other contexts as well, I would say that in a situation of acute conflict, like we have, for instance, with Ukraine at the moment, the security situation tends to be by far the number one, the most important situation factor determining return intentions, followed by personal circumstances. To what extent you can make a living in the host country, whether you have dependents that have stayed back in Ukraine, for instance, and so on. And then as the final and least important factor, host country policies, which much to the detriment of many European policymakers is less important than we think.
Okay, that's good. So now we have a ranking from Ravenna of these three variables. Oleksandra, just one sentence, please, because we will need to finish.
One sentence is not possible. Tatiana and Ravenna talked more, so sorry. As I said before, security is number one. So I mean, like, if security improves, then there is kind of bigger likelihood that Ukrainians will return to Ukraine. But then we actually talk about individual circumstances, because I mean, like, people left Ukraine not because they wanted really, but even though some probably did, but because of the war. So the women were flying, I mean, like, leaving Ukraine to protect their children. Because for children, it's really kind of, I mean, like, I do have two children, so I know how it's for children, I mean, like, to be, especially when there is kind of a missile attack and a drone attack nearby. And some women decided that it's more secure to be abroad. But again, we have to remember that many men stay in Ukraine just because they are forbidden to actually leave Ukraine. And as a result, this is kind of broken families. And some people do return because they want to reunite families. So children miss their fathers and the women miss their husbands. And as a result, some families are united in Ukraine. Just for this reason, it's individual reason. Some still think that better education and safe environment and the blue sky without drones and missiles is more important than anything else for their children. And therefore, they still stay in European countries and other countries. So it's kind of even not individual factors sometimes, but it's also kind of behavioral. What I think is kind of better value for my children now, and whether I think that it's better for children to be in united family with fathers, or it's actually I have to protect my children and I'm taking them out and I have to ensure that they are in a safe environment. And therefore, it's kind of really important. But then we still come to the fact of host countries' policies when we say that some countries are talking about actually liquidating the policies of providing free housing, supporting housing, etc. Ukrainians who didn't find a job or something like that, they will not be able to actually pay for the housing, like for renting, and therefore they will have to return home. And another individual factor is some Ukrainians are in the European Union now because they lost housing. This housing is on occupied territory by Russia. And in Ukraine, we unfortunately do not have enough social housing, and therefore Ukrainian government cannot provide everybody the housing. And this is something which is important for Ukrainians to return home also, to ensure that housing is here.
Yeah, I'll interrupt that. So, Tanya, I think I haven't got time to come to you. I'm very sorry. I mean, this has been a very rich discussion, and I think we have covered an awful lot of ground. And the conversation there was really good that the panelists started engaging with each other and their responses. So I hope everyone in our audience will join me in thanking our panel for giving us their insights on this extremely important issue, one which is currently politically especially challenging given the politics of many host countries, as was mentioned by Tatiana Termacic. Thank you to our audience. Thank you for providing a couple of questions. There will be a policy brief report based on this discussion, which will be published in due course and on the WebHub website and to our mailing list. As I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, this is the end of this particular series. We are grateful to everyone who has participated in them, whether as a speaker in the audience and also our interpreting team. Thank you to our partners who helped prepare these events, Pavlo Rad at Ukrainian Prism, Victoria Levkovets at the Stockholm Centre for East European Studies, Tanya, who spoke today, Tanya Chulitskaya, that is, Yehor Azakevich, and Professor Elena Krostelyova here at Warwick. Just need to say we have an in-person conference in London in June. The full programme for that is on our website, and you can register interest if you have not already. It is oversubscribed, so please don't assume you have space unless you hear from us, or until you hear from us, I should say. And that's Ukraine-Belarus and the Complex Geopolitics of Europe is the title of that conference. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to our panel once again, and goodbye.